Alright, so about a month ago now, I made a video on CwcvilleGuardian, which is quite a departure from my normal style of content. It's not something I really typically do. However, having seen like Gino Samuel's documentary on CwcvilleGuardian, as well as a lot of the culture surrounding CwcvilleGuardian, I felt it was important to make kind of a reality check kind of video. In this video, while acknowledging that CwcvilleGuardian is a pretty irredeemable person, I kind of wanted to reflect on the role that the trolls played in CwcvilleGuardian becoming who they are. Now, for more detail on that, if you haven't already, do check out the previous CwcvilleGuardian video, as what this video serves to do is not so much to really recap or retell that story in any way, but to effectively respond to the comment section of that video. Because that video is one of my most popular videos I've made. The comment section is chock full of comments that I don't have the time to respond to one by one, so I've kind of chosen a handful of specific styles of comment, I guess, to respond to in this video. There are a few bits of information that were not in the previous video that I think might have benefited, so I'm going to address them in this one. But it's mainly just kind of my response to the conversation, basically. So we are going to begin off at point number 1. This is something I am seeing a great deal of comments about, and it is one that I do want to quash quite early on in this video because I do deem it to be pretty trivial, and it is something that's likely going to come up again. So I did preface my previous video by saying that I would be using they, them pronouns for CwcvilleGuardian. And there are some that think this might have been some performative political statement, and there are some that wanted to inform me that no, the trans community does not accept CwcvilleGuardian. That CwcvilleGuardian had a lot of ulterior motives in why they would transition. That it was all kind of a ploy to kind of hit on lesbians and kind of get in their pants and stuff like that. And listen, I do get that because it definitely does come across that way. Especially with how CwcvilleGuardian has a history of being very disrespectful towards women and having a very distorted view of what a woman actually is. But I just want to say straight up, I don't think I could have been more even-handed with this matter if I tried. If CwcvilleGuardian is genuine and serious about this transition, then I didn't call them by he, him pronouns, so I didn't risk being transphobic. If CwcvilleGuardian is just being performative and just wants to get into women's pants and is using the transition for that, well, I didn't call them she, her pronouns either. I just stuck with they, them. So I'm not being political or performative or anything like that. I am neither honoring or invalidating because they, them is completely neutral. It can be used for anyone. So given that I am neither a trans person or CwcvilleGuardian, I don't think I have a right to determine what the actual absolute truth is behind CwcvilleGuardian's transition. So that is why I did that. And you know, there have been just comments that have been pointing that out, and that's all fine. And there have been comments from trans people explaining why they don't accept CwcvilleGuardian's transition as valid. And again, that is all fine. That is all fair enough. You do you. That is completely fine. There are, however, people that are turning it into like an anti-trans political statement, accusing me of being some woke soy boy. And all I really have to say to that is, like, in the story of CwcvilleGuardian, a story of abuse, sexual assault, bullying, harassment, the dangers of being terminally online. If me using they, them pronouns for CwcvilleGuardian is the thing you want to fixate on, then, well, I'll let you fill in the blanks. You decide. You just take from that what you will, I guess. But yes, I used the they, them pronouns, and I will be continuing to use they, them pronouns in this video. Another thing I did want to touch on is that in my previous CwcvilleGuardian video, I did refer to CwcvilleGuardian repeatedly as mentally impaired as opposed to autistic. Now, CwcvilleGuardian was quite open about being autistic. It's kind of a known thing that CwcvilleGuardian was autistic, and very unfortunately, definitely for worse, CwcvilleGuardian did kind of become the poster child for autism on the internet, which definitely shouldn't be the case. Part of the reason why I refer to CwcvilleGuardian as mentally impaired is because I just don't think that CwcvilleGuardian should be this poster child for autism, because I don't believe that autism was any kind of determining factor in what happened with CwcvilleGuardian. Education about autism is pretty damn scarce. More scarce than it should be. And I'm not particularly educated when it comes to autism. However, I can say I have a lot of friends that do have autism. And they are about as far from CwcvilleGuardian as Earth is from Alpha Centauri. So a lot of people would say that CwcvilleGuardian would often use their autism as an excuse, which they did. But autism really doesn't excuse any of this. It doesn't even explain it. As far as I'm concerned, CwcvilleGuardian must have had all kinds of personality disorders. And I don't know a lot about them. I can't try and, speculate a diagnosis or anything like that, but Chris Chan definitely had more up with them than just autism. And I don't think it's just that Chris Chan is an inherent piece of human garbage. I do think there are things that can be rehabilitated, and I do think there were a lot of mental health problems with Chris Chan that needed support that it didn't get, and were left to kind of languish. Autism is obviously something that does require support, but a lot of what is wrong with Chris Chan I don't think can be explained by autism, nor do I think it can be attributed to autism. So another point I made was that Bob Chandler should have done more to keep Chris Chan away from the internet. There is the famous quote where he says he's gonna cut the internet down. However, I do need to say this, going by everything I've heard in the documentary, Bob Chandler was still ultimately the more supportive parent between him and Bob. Yes, Bob did have a history of manipulation, and there are elements of that do come across in the documentary. I have been told by, I think, a couple of the comments saying that Bob Chandler did want Chris Chan off the internet. However, Bob Chandler would keep Bob from doing that using some incredibly manipulative tactics. So I do want to state that I don't, alleviate Bob Chandler of any responsibility either. And that can be quite a tough pill to swallow, because obviously Bob Chandler is probably one of the greatest victims of Chris Chan. Now, the truth is, from the jump, Bob and Bob were fairly irresponsible parents. Like, having a child at the age they were and them constantly going out drinking, the hoarding situation, there is still a lot wrong with Chris Chan's upbringing. But I feel like it might have come across that maybe I was just pinning it all on Bob, when really, it's kind of, there is joint responsibility here. And ultimately, I do still think that Bob was quite a supportive parent, or wanted to be quite a supportive parent. But there were definitely things that he neglected, and there were definitely things that Bob neglected. Now, the truth is, Chris Chan did ultimately need more support, because obviously being someone with special needs, someone who was clearly grappling with a lot of problems back then, should have gone to like a special school, one that could facilitate their needs a lot better. However, it is worth noting that back then, autism was handled very differently. And I can understand that maybe Bob and Bob didn't want Chris to not have a chance to kind of flourish, to kind of be able to pursue their own creative endeavors. I mean, as it is known, Bob Chandler wanted to kind of encourage Sonichu as kind of going on to become something of like a mascot for autism, which, oh, bless his heart, that, oof. The optics of that aren't good, but obviously that's more attributed to who Chris Chan is than just the very idea of a Sonichu. A lot of mistakes were made, and I do want to say I'm not completely inhuman. I understand that these are very human mistakes from a time where autism wasn't anywhere near as well understood as it is today, and today it's still not properly understood. So while I do want to acknowledge the part they played in it, I don't want to necessarily completely vilify them. It's easy to kind of have very emotional responses, because Chris Chan is a walking consequence, and consequences often come with emotional responses. This isn't me saying I would have done better in their position back then at that time and everything like that. I mean, I'd want to, but at the end of the day, I don't want to have kids anyway. So kind of segueing on to the next point, I do recognize that much of what happened to Chris Chan was ultimately a product of the time. In education, medical fields, professional fields, autism and the kind of disorders that Chris Chan definitely has were not anywhere near as well understood back then as they would be today. These things were far more stigmatized back in the 80s, and it is easy to forget that, Chris Chan would have done a lot of that growing up in the 1980s. But also just the internet as well, unfortunately. It's a known phrase, the internet was a wild west back then. This would have been the time of like the AOL dial-up internet. Chris Chan, as far as a lot of people are concerned, might as well have just been a completely digital character. The internet celebrity was quite a new concept, and while I would definitely say it's common sense to say that a human being, whether they're behind a screen or not, does have feelings of their own, it's easy to say that now with hindsight, now that we understand the online celebrity, now that more of us are putting ourselves out there on the internet to broadcast ourselves. Hope you like that, YouTube. I used your slogan, how nostalgic. With the growth of the internet is the growth of education, and that is a good thing, but back then, it didn't matter. You wouldn't be held accountable for anything on the internet. What you say on there is dust in the wind as far as anyone else is concerned. So for every quote like, "The pickle man got me again," and for every Liquid Chris putting on this performance, imitating Chris Chan, going toe-to-toe. It was all entertainment back then, and no one was really held responsible for anything. Nowadays, people on the internet are far more humanized because far more of us use it, so we have more of an understanding of what people on the other side of the screen are going through, and that doesn't apply to everything. I mean, like, look at the way people treat each other on Twitter. But if anything, the burden of social responsibility has flung far in the other direction now, to the point where you could be a grown-ass man in your 30s, but you called someone a nasty slur in the AOL chat room when you were like 9 years old, and it'll come back to haunt you and you'll lose your job for it. We are learning. We are learning how to grapple social responsibility in the internet age. We've still got a long way to go. We still got to be a lot less ravenous, a lot less bloodthirsty towards those who oppose us, but we're getting there. We'll balance things out eventually, I hope. But I do acknowledge that, like, what I was saying in my video was very much a 2020s perspective on something that did happen in the 2000s. However, it does need to be said that even in the 2000s, there are certain things that were completely and utterly unacceptable. It being the early 2000s was not an excuse for Blue Spike. This was the kid who posed as an online girlfriend for Chris Chan and basically catfished them into having sexual conversations with a 13-year-old boy. Among other, frankly, horrific things that Blue Spike put poor Chris Chan through. Now, with that being said, I also acknowledge that there were other trolls, such as the troll behind the Clyde Cash persona, that will have put Blue Spike up to it, that will have kind of egged Blue Spike on to do this. A 13-year-old doesn't necessarily just go out of their way to do this, especially when they're in a chat room with other trolls. And yes, those trolls did ask Blue Spike to slow his roll, but even then, you're kind of taking the moral high ground when it's too late. It's kind of what I was getting at there. But also, even then, Blue Spike does have responsibility here because the way he was treating Chris Chan was outright psychotic, and no, he's just a kid really doesn't excuse that. Listen, I've got a history of being a messed up, edgy kid, but like, oof, that is another realm. Come on now. So while we're on the subject of trolls, I did kind of mention that, like, all of the trolls do need to reflect on this. All of the trolls do need to grow from this and accept responsibility and possibly even accountability in some cases. In an ideal world, if, like, the right authorities knew, Blue Spike, yeah, would have to take accountability for that, but, like, at the end of the day, Blue Spike was a kid at the time, and the legal courts have this idea that kids are in just a complete and total state of delirium at all times, and are therefore not responsible for any of their actions whatsoever. So, like, yeah, no, let's not let my idealism cloud the reality of the situation here. Is like, yeah, Blue Spike would get off with a slap on the wrist at worst. Maybe a severe grounding, I don't know. But okay, some people did take issue with me kind of throwing Liquid Chris in there as well, because Liquid Chris was ultimately just a guy who was acting as this opposing Chris Chan. And it was all entertaining. They had this SingStar competition. It was like this cartoon villain mustache twirling thing, the opposite Chris Chan, all that. And I've said, like, obviously, while impersonating someone who is clearly mentally impaired is not really a great thing, again, acknowledging this was the internet back then. Like, internet humor was in a really rubbish place in, like, the early 2000s to even, like, the late 2010s. But, like, I get it, it seems harmless enough. When I kind of was referring to Liquid Chris as well, I was mainly referring to kind of the collaboration between, obviously there was Liquid Chris's actor, Liquid Chris's kind of writer, it's weird how much production went into this, and of course, Casey. And if you ask me, Casey did the worst of it. This was another instance of a troll trying to create a scenario that Chris Chan could learn from, be it the phone call with a potential sweetheart's father, which by the way was just full of the wrong messages, might I add, or Casey herself being a potential girlfriend for Chris Chan so that she could kind of point out where Chris Chan fails, basically. And I acknowledge that it's not like Chris Chan didn't poke the wasp's nest either here, because Chris Chan called Casey pretending to be Liquid Chris, who was, of course, like, supposed to be kind of Casey's boyfriend at that time. And yeah, that's creepy as hell and does deserve to be called out. But Casey kind of had the guise of looking out for Chris Chan's best interests until suddenly she didn't. Suddenly she would just lambast Chris Chan for no real apparent reason. And oftentimes would definitely teach them the wrong lessons. But it just comes from a perspective of, who are you to be teaching Chris Chan how to be? Now, obviously, like, it's quite easy to look at the average person and say, that is probably a better person than Chris Chan, right? But fair enough. But, like, Chris Chan really needs, like, professional help. Someone that knows how to help that kind of person. And if Chris Chan isn't getting that help, it's not really for a stranger on the internet to take up that responsibility. because then you are responsible for the outcome of that. But okay, Liquid Chris was just a harmless bit of roleplay and Casey was trying to help Chris Chan become a better person, right? Well, here's an excerpt from episode 20 of the Chris Chan documentary, and I want you to tell me if any of this was at all necessary, or any kind of healthy way of teaching Chris Chan any kind of lesson. I want you to tell me if this was just a bit of a harmless joke.
She and I are friends, and my name is Christian.
Wait, which am I? Am I your girlfriend or your friend? You keep going back and forth. You're lying again.
You will only stay friends, Mr. Ian Brandon Anderson. That is as far as you go.
Look, Chris, I'm so sick of you calling me by that stupid name. I am the real deal.
Shut up.
I have all the proof and everything. You're the copycat.
No,
okay, who am I going to believe? The guy who's hot and sexy and can play a guitar, or the person who lies to me every fucking night?
Yeah, and not to mention that he is fat and ugly.
I am not fat, god damn it!
Yeah, you are. You look like you weigh a good 220 pounds.
I do not weigh 220 pounds. I weigh a lot less than that.
Yeah,
you
weak
little son of a bitch. I am
Like,
so
you
sick.
know,
If
you
you
said I
put
was
me
being
down
kind.
and call me all these insults to my face.
I mean, you're not even going to live to see doing the same thing in 5 years, if you're not dead.
So, like, that's the thing. I don't think we should distort, like, the whole Liquid Chris saga. Because it was kind of all fun and games up until it wasn't. And, I mean, it certainly wasn't for Chris Chan either. And I'll get a little more into that later on in a later point. For now, I just want to quickly move on to Alec Benson Liry, as Alec Benson Liry was a troll that I didn't actually talk about in the previous video. Maybe I might have just done, like, a fleeting mention of Alec Benson Liry. So, I'm going to be honest, I don't believe in like picking like favorite trolls or anything like that, but Alec Benson Liry is a very interesting case. Like, there are elements to Alec Benson Liry that I can kind of almost appreciate. So at the time Alec Benson Liry came onto the scene, Chris Chan was being very vocal about dismissing people with Asperger's as people that were just trying to steal Autism's thunder, which is ridiculous. But okay, it's what it is. So Alec Benson Liry kind of went at this from the perspective of being someone who has Asperger's syndrome. Now, I don't know if Alec Benson Liry actually had Asperger's syndrome. I'm going to be honest, I certainly hope that he did, because otherwise this is all pretty non-PC, and more on that later. But what Alec Benson Liry was doing for the most part was putting pro-gay ads on the CwcvilleGuardian, which would obviously rub Chris Chan up the wrong way, but at the same time, there's nothing really too heinous going on there. If anything, like, Chris Chan is in the wrong for getting rubbed up the wrong way by that. Which is like, okay, take a genuine high road where you can, I guess. But Alec Benson Liry kind of created a series of comic books called Asperchu, with, like, a version of Sonichu that has, like, Asperger's syndrome that is loosely based on Chris Chan. And the idea was that Chris Chan would call Alec Benson Liry out for kind of plagiarizing Sonichu, when in actuality, Asperchu is no more of a plagiarism of Sonichu than Sonichu is of Sonic the Hedgehog and Pikachu. And Alec, Benson, Liry would explain this at length to Chris Chan. Now, I'm going to be honest, while I can certainly think of better things to do with your time, and again, I want to bring up my main point a little later on, Liry wouldn't go out of his way to insult Chris Chan or be aggressive towards Chris Chan. Liry would just really kind of call out Chris Chan's hypocrisy, and I don't really see much wrong with that. The only thing I could see optically wrong with that would be if, Alec Benson Liry is claiming to have Asperger's when he doesn't. Because then it's not really your place to do that. But, again, I'm firmly against kind of treating these trolls like they are fictional characters and picking favorites and stuff. But I definitely kind of detected that Alec Benson Liry was quite a bit smarter than, say, the trolls that were, say, Casey, that would be fine with, going under the pretense of helping Chris out, when in actuality they were really just taking pleasure in putting the person down. I think, of course, the worst thing that Alec Benson Liry probably did was the Lars phone call between Chris and this fictitious ex-boyfriend of, I think it was this fictitious girlfriend, Jackie. Now, I think the fictitious girlfriend stuff is all very shady. I don't like that stuff. And the real problematic part of this, and again, I must stress, the internet now is a different place to what it was back then. This would have been far more acceptable back than it is today. Alec Benson Liry was basically playing a very stereotypical, and in a negative way, black person. And I don't think that Alec Benson Liry was himself black. And yes, this did involve a few choice N-words flying around. And yeah, not for Chris Chan's sake, but you probably shouldn't do that. But at the same time, I kind of found it hilarious how he had an obsession with model boats and how he was so friendly towards Chris Chan and how the phone call actually ended up being oddly wholesome in places. I'm probably opening a whole can of worms by saying that, but there's a lot wrong with this. But at the same time, again, I think Liry was kind of somewhat clever, and I like that Alec Benson Liry wouldn't just pile it onto abuse in the end. I can almost kind of respect the grind here. By no means is any of this the right thing to do or even a good thing to do, but I kind of get it. Alec Benson Liry is definitely a lot trickier to talk about than a lot of the other Chris Chan trolls. And I think this kind of does feed into a little bit of the misconceptions surrounding the video I made. Like some people saying, do we have no right to call out a person like Chris Chan, someone who is behaving in that way on the internet? And no, people have every right to call out Chris Chan's behaviors. It's much more nuanced than I think comments like that give it credit for. Chris Chan would go out on the internet and just drag people with Asperger's syndrome, drag homosexuals, would call out their teachers by name. This is someone who did need something done about them. And really, ultimately, by their parents. Which is where Bob and Bob definitely kind of failed. Which is where things like the education system in the 1980s failed. So make no mistake, I'm not saying that if it weren't for, the trolls and it weren't for people calling Chris Chan out for the terrible things they were saying on the internet, I'm not saying that Chris Chan would have necessarily lived a healthy life, There are a lot of contributing factors, and one of them was certainly Chris for who they were, because Chris was someone who would apologize to shut people up, but wouldn't learn from their mistakes. But it is one thing to say, hey, what you're saying or what you're doing isn't okay, and here's why. Because when you do that, you're kind of trying to educate a person. You're trying to make that person better. Whereas when you're creating fictitious partners and fictitious scenarios that result in this person's downfall, it then becomes your own amusement. It then becomes your own attraction. It becomes a selfish thing. And I do notice this as kind of a pattern as well, and I think this happened throughout a lot of trolls, is that they maybe started off wanting something positive to come from this, but ended up just doing it for themselves. Casey went from trying to help Chris get a job, eat well and exercise, to having phone calls with a fictitious father figure that was completely berating Chris over every little thing. Alec Benson Liry went from someone who was trying to call out Chris's hypocrisy to yet another fictitious girlfriend catfish character, now with a racist stereotype boyfriend. And this could fall down to disillusionment with Chris themselves. You try to help, it backfires, and then you just try and get whatever amusement you can out of it. And there's something very human about that. But it's definitely not good. And that's the kind of point I wanted to make with my video. Wasn't that Chris Chan was some saint who should have just been left to their own devices, or that people shouldn't have ever tried to call Chris out on anything. It was that the only real way to help and educate someone is to just educate them. You don't need to form these wily coyote schemes. You don't need to try and get fame out of it from like a circle of these trolls. It's just sad, frankly. But I do at the same time have to be realistic. The internet is going to do what the internet is going to do, and Chris Chan definitely set themselves up for that. But it doesn't excuse it. There's a definite power imbalance here. Chris Chan is a very obviously mentally impaired person. And I don't know if all of the people that were preying on them were mentally impaired either. So there is definitely kind of a punching down thing going on there. I think it's just important to learn the right lessons from this, and that is ultimately that there might have been some moments that were entertaining. There might be some moments of memorable quotes, but when you see someone like Chris Chan out there, unless you're going to be honest with them, it's probably better to just stay away. I do just want to note, though, that I do have some humility towards this whole situation, because while, yes, I do think people need to be held responsible and held accountable beyond just Chris Chan himself, people can change, people can grow, and people are ultimately the product of the environment that they're in, and the internet was a Wild West at that time. That doesn't excuse any of it, but it does go a little ways to explaining it. From what I understand, the guy that played Liquid Chris would go on to be very remorseful for what happened with Chris. And today they work in helping to fight cancer, and that's a really good thing. I am a firm believer that people should be allowed a chance to grow. But that doesn't mean that we can't all learn lessons from their mistakes, especially if we see an internet landscape that clearly is learning the wrong lessons from all of this. And so the cycle repeats once again, and now we've got this new Cyrax character on the scene who's considered the next Chris Chan. I'm tired. I guess the bottom line is there are going to be times when we see things that are just not acceptable. And we might be tempted to kind of go for the throat, you know, but we really have to control ourselves, or else we risk becoming another villain in a story where there are no good guys. And that's really the point I just wanted to clarify with all of this, ultimately. If you do have any further questions, we'll keep the conversation going. Whether or not I respond to comments, whether or not this gets anywhere near as big as the previous Chris Chan video, it remains to be seen. It could be that this one doesn't do gangbusters and I can just respond to comments one by one. Otherwise, maybe I will do another form of follow-up, but I just want to put it out there. I'm really not about doing, like, internet culture videos that much unless I feel like I actually have something to say on the subject. I'm not going to be looking for other internet ridiculed characters to talk about necessarily. It's just, with Chris Chan, I did have quite a response to that story, which I felt like I needed to share. So if you are subscribing hoping for more of that kind of stuff, no guarantees of anything, to be honest, but if you like things like Sonic the Hedgehog and Spider-Man and stuff like that, that's really my wheelhouse. So yeah, I think this video's gone on about long enough. What do you guys think? You know, let's keep the conversation going and discuss, and until the next time, have a good old day, I guess. Thanks for watching.